Hey guys, welcome back. Chapter 4.2, the importance of biodiversity. Why do we care about biodiversity? What's the big deal with it? What does it matter if some frogs go extinct or some insects go extinct? You know, why do we really care? How does it impact me? Biological diversity, we're just talking about the diversity of living things on the planet. And we can break that down into multiple different ways. So I'm going to hit them just really shortly here, and we'll kind of throw up a picture and look at some individually here. So we can just talk about species diversity. The number and evenness of species on the planet, or really specifically in an area, because we're going to look more at like certain ecosystems, etc. We can talk about genetic diversity. How diverse are the genes or genetic variety in a particular organism or organisms? And this can vary quite wildly. Ecosystem diversity. This particular biome, what is the diversity within that particular biome? Some biomes have a lot more different types of organisms in them than others, and what do some of those look like? We can look at functional diversity, the different types of processes, like we may talk about this chemical cycling, etc. How many of those cycling processes are actually being done and how frequently, etc. And then we'll just talk some specifically about the advantages of biologically diverse ecosystems. I mean, in a sense, more plant matter, more biological mass, higher NPP, and you can have more organisms supported, etc. And we'll look at some of the traits. This kind of goes with evolution in this chapter as well. So let's take a look at the first. Kind of the picture we have up here incorporates a lot of the various things in it. We've got some different little sections, but in this case, kind of species diversity. When we talk about species diversity, and usually we're going to talk about an area, we may talk about the whole planet. But if I'm looking at, say the woods near my house, or the forest in Wyoming, or the rainforest in the Amazon, etc., we can talk about species diversity. We can talk about this in terms of species richness and species evenness. Species richness, the number of different species there. So the forest is going to have a greater number of species than the desert. And the desert is going to have fewer than grasslands per se. Because in the grasslands, there's not trees for things to climb up in and hide in by and large, so everything's pretty much on the ground or flying in the air. So you're going to have less species richness than, say, in a forest. And a rainforest tends to have even greater, because a rainforest has really big trees, medium trees, short trees, and understories. They have multiple layers for things to be in. So species richness is just the number of species. You know, there's 200 species in this area versus 100 species in this area versus 2,000 species in that area. And I may just be talking about fairly large organisms with that kind of number, trees, animals, etc. Species evenness, the comparative abundance of all the species in an environment. For instance, I say, ooh, there are 200 species that live there. Well, I know something about its richness, but I don't know about the evenness. Are there actually a lot of one type of animal and only a few of the others? So its species evenness may not be very much. It could actually be pretty low. So I can have species richness, which is high or low. I can have species evenness, which is either high or low. Now, somewhere like a rainforest is going to tend to have high richness and high evenness. Rainforest, lots of various lots of organisms. They live in different areas, so it has both high richness and high evenness. Let's take something like I had a recent trip to North Carolina and we passed by some of the Christmas tree farms. Well, there wasn't a lot of richness. It was mainly 2 or 3 types of trees, and there wasn't much evenness either. much more of this one type of thing than another. In other words, the trees weren't the only things living there. Other organisms as well lived there, but there weren't many types, and it was very uneven. So rainforest is going to tend to have high richness and high evenness, where somewhere like a tree farm is going to have low richness and low evenness as well. Tend to have more of one type of something than another. So let's also take a look at genetic diversity. Now the picture we have back here is of the Caribbean snail, or the Caribbean, I guess, depending on where you come from. But you notice there's a lot of different colors. It goes from white to kind of an orange to a black. The spirals, it has black spirals, white spirals, light spirals. The size of the snails varies, etc. So this shows its ability to adapt. Now they are sexual reproduction, so they have genes from a male and a female of the species. So their individual size and shell shape can be slightly different. This allows them to adapt to their environment. If it's normally the darker colored snails because of where they live, but if the environment changes and they have a lighter color sand or something else in, a different coloring may allow one snail to survive longer than another. Survival of the fittest. Now, survival of the fittest doesn't mean the physically strongest. It means the ones best adapted to survive. So this variation in diversity allows them to adapt and survive. If a plant has very little possibility for adaptation and its environment changes, gets warmer, gets cooler, less rain, more rain, the coloring changes and they can't camouflage themselves to adapt, then they tend to die off much quicker. So the variety of genes found in a population or species tends to be beneficial. So once again, in biodiversity, more tends to be the better. Like with humans, there's a wide variety within humans. Sure, I can spot a human from a dog in a second, but that human is going to have a lot of individual traits that allow them to adapt and survive in their environment. Another one, ecological diversity. Now the picture we have up here is kind of showing ones from a rainforest down to a desert. Different types of trees, etc., things that we may find. And this is really the diversity of Earth's biomes. Biomes we'll talk about specifically in another chapter. I think it's chapter 7. But in a sense, a biome is just a large area of Earth. So rainforests equate a biome. Now, not just one rainforest, but all rainforests together constitute a biome. All deserts together make up a biome. We have different types. Deciduous forests. So I could have a deciduous forest in Georgia. I could have a deciduous forest in Germany. They're going to have some separate differences, but collectively, it's the deciduous forest biome. Has more in common than not when we compare it to a rainforest or a desert. So, diversity of our biomes. Biomes tend to be identified by the plants that grow there, and the types of plants that grow there are determined by the temperature range and the amount of precipitation it gets. More rain, you can have larger organisms. So when we look up here, the rainforest has the tallest trees in it. It gets rain almost every day. Then we have a coniferous forest. Coniferous forest tends to be in colder climates, either way up north or on the top of mountains. And these are evergreen, so they stay green year round, and they also tend to reach up pretty high. Then we have the deciduous forest. This is what we might find, in the northern edge of Florida, in Gainesville where we live, on up into Georgia, most of the east coast of the United States, and for that matter, the east coast of North America tends to be deciduous forest. We find deciduous forest in Europe, Germany, many places. Then we have what it has is a thorn forest, and then into grasslands, and we can either have tall grasslands we get into shorter grasslands or desert. You're going to go from scrub desert into true desert with very little. But these are just some of the aspects of what we range from. Some of our biggest, largest organisms tend to be in forests, and then medium size into grasslands, savanna areas, and some of our lesser organisms tend to be found in the desert. There's always exceptions, but this is a general rule. So, ecological diversity. We have a lot of different ecosystems out there. Rainforest, tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest, deciduous forest, scrub deserts, deserts, tall grasslands, short grasslands, you name it, a lot of diversity in the planet. Now, if we just look up here, I'm just going to go straight across the United States. Now, the United States, we have coast on both sides, and we have really three kind of mountain ranges. On the far east coast, near us, just above us, beginning in Georgia, are the Appalachian Mountains. These are some of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, so they've eroded a lot. They've been worn down. They're kind of short. So because of that, the water coming in off the coastline can come up and over the mountains and make it farther inland. The mountains on the far west coast are much higher, and they tend to block the water from making it across them, which drastically affects what our climate is. So I'm going to move from the east coast all the way across. The Pacific, the jet stream is bringing warm, moist air up from the equator. As that warm, moist air, it comes up over into the east coast. So the entire east coast up to the Mississippi River is pretty much forest. We get lots of water. The rains don't carry as far inland past the Mississippi very much, and they begin to decrease in frequency and amount. We tend to move into grasslands. Then as we move into the Rocky Mountains and it begins to move up higher, we go from grasslands into some pine forest, coniferous forest. And then we come off the backside. In the United States, we tend to have the Rocky Mountains, so we have the East Coast, the Midwest, and we hit the mountain range. Between this mountain range and this mountain range is our desert. This is where you find Nevada, Arizona, etc., some of these states. Even up into Oregon. Oregon winds up being high desert on the inland side of the mountains. So this whole swath of America tends to be more desert-like. The rain can't make it up over the Rockies, and on the Sierra Nevada or the Sierras or the Olympic Mountains, the rain comes in from the Pacific coast and it's coming down this way. So we get a lot of rain dumped on that side of the mountains, but it's a rain desert on the other side. So we go on the East Coast, deciduous forest, into our grasslands, up into the mountains where we get a pine forest, coniferous forest, down into our desert. Up in the Sierras, we go into pine or coniferous forest again, and then as it comes down off to the coastland, we tend to have more of a coastal chaparral. Now this would be down in the south. Far up in the north, we have actually a temperate rainforest. Lots of rain in the Pacific Northwest, but down towards the south, near San Diego, etc., now we're running into scrub desert or chaparral desert. But anyway, just a variety of biomes that we see in the United States. Now, several things are interesting here. When we talk about these sections, we get what we call edge effects. So let's say I have the deciduous forest and it's giving way to the prairie or the plains. Well, right at the edge, it's still foresty. We have trees. And over here, it's more grassland. But right between here, we get this edge effect. It's not the same climate as inside the core of the forest, but it's also not here. So we get different organisms that tend to live there. Different types of plants live there. It's a little brighter, a little more sunny, a little less rain, not as much deep forest. So you tend to not have as many organisms that live in this edge, And you often find kind of odd species, things that prefer this edge, and you don't find them here or here. And these edge effects tend to be much smaller areas. And usually you don't have a real hard line between this biome and that biome, or this ecosystem and that ecosystem. There's this kind of in-between area, and that's what we call a ecotone, where we have these edge effects. So we can study something, what's going on in this ecotone, and it's hard to define. Which one is it? Is it grasslands or is it forest? It's almost a little bit of neither. Then we're going to look at functional diversity. When we talk about functional diversity, we're kind of revisiting this picture, something that we've talked about in the past. But these are the biological and chemical processes. It's the energy flow. Matter recycling is what we're talking about in functional diversity. What sort of energy flow do we have? In other words, what food chains or food webs exist there? A desert has less functional diversity than a forest does. A prairie has more functional diversity than a desert does, but less than a forest. Because of the energy flow, how much is coming in, how many organisms are there, from producer or primary to secondary to tertiary, etc. How many different levels of food chain are there? So when we look at this functional diversity, we're looking at the flow of energy, always going to come from the sun, but then the plant's getting it from the sun, what's eating the plant, what's eating the thing that eats the plant, what's eating the thing that eats the thing that eats the plant, and how many of them are there. Now ultimately, the more plants that we can have in an area, the more biomass, which comes to that NPP, net primary productivity. The more net primary productivity, the higher diversity we have. The bottom line, the more biodiversity we have, the safer we all actually are. As we begin killing off or anything in that system dies off, it creates issues, creates problems. We get less biodiversity. The less diversity we have, typically the less safe an area is. It just begins to cause problems. So in the world of environmental science, we want to protect our biodiversity as much as is possible or practical. This brings us up to the end of section 2. Take care, guys, and we'll see you next time when we begin looking at some of the specific roles of species within an ecosystem. See you around.